Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming out this afternoon. It's good to see a full house. I'm Tom Laney. I'm the director of the McFarland Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture. This is our home in Ream Library. The McFarland Center sponsors and supports programs that explore basic human questions of meaning, morality, and mutual obligation. One of the McFarland Center's key initiatives is the Kraft Hyatt Program for Jewish-Christian Understanding, which promotes greater understanding in our community of Judaism, Jewish-Christian relations, contemporary Jewish life, Jewish history, and the Holocaust. Through the Kraft Hyatt program, we sponsor a variety of lectures, performances, and screenings, provide study and research opportunity for faculty and students, including in Jerusalem, and support the development of new courses such as Professor Bertrand Doughton's very powerful Maymester course in Central Europe on history, memory, and the Holocaust, which deals with some of the issues we'll talk about today. I encourage you to learn more about that on our website at holycross.edu/McFarland Center. Some of our past programs are there. This one will be as well in a couple days for your friends who miss it so that they can catch up and watch it. Today I'm really pleased to introduce a talk on a disorientingly painful subject, one that certainly honors the memory and priorities of the man who was the primary force behind the Kraft Hyatt program, the late Jacob Hyatt, whose parents, brother, and sisters were killed in the Holocaust. Some of you may know that the wings of the library, the underground wings, are named in Jacob Hyatt's parents' honor, and he was a 20-year trustee and someone who was very generous to the college in many ways. Our speaker, Omer Bartov, is the John P. Birkelund Distinguished Professor of European History at Brown University. He'll tell us about a story he spent more than 20 years uncovering. A native of Israel, Professor Bartov's early work focused on Nazi indoctrination of the German armed forces and on Nazi crimes in World War II. In this vein, he authored The Eastern Front, 1941-45, and Hitler's Army, which has been translated into many languages. After moving to the United States in 1989, he began to focus more on genocide. His books on that subject include Murder in Our Midst, Mirrors of Destruction, and Germany's War and the Holocaust. The books that bring him here today are the outcome of decades of research in his mother's hometown, Buczacz, in Galicia, a region that has over the centuries been part of Poland, Austria, and which is now part of Ukraine. It's an area that is that's been brutalized by wars in the first half of the 20th century, and as we will hear, its once large Jewish population was decimated in World War II. A 2007 book, Erased, Vanishing Traces of Jewish Galicia in Present-Day Ukraine, begins in Buczacz and journeys to 20 Ukrainian towns, recreating the histories of the vibrant Jewish and Polish communities who once lived there and describing what is left today following their brutal and complete destruction. His newest book, Anatomy of a Genocide, which I'll point out is often also available for sale outside, was published last year. It traces the 400-year history of the town to show how Jews, Poles, and Ukrainians who had once lived together for centuries became casualties of genocide. It's a powerful cautionary tale of how the people, neighbors, friends, family, perpetuated a genocide. So there's a lot to pay attention to, and I'm grateful to welcome Professor Omer Bartov to talk to us about that today.
Thank you very much for coming this afternoon. I will try in the next 45-50 minutes to give you some idea of research that I had undertaken over the last 20 years, as was mentioned, that began as a very modest initial undertaking and expanded to something much deeper and, to my mind, more important. So what I will try to do is first to tell you a little bit about what this book is about, what the main questions in my mind were, how they changed over time. And then I'll try to explain what I think are the main outcomes of this research, what I found out from focusing on this one little town that I had known before and that I think has some relevance to the study both of the Holocaust specifically, and to genocide more generally. So I started this research in the 1990s. And in the 1990s, you may know, the Holocaust came to be recognized quite belatedly as an important event in the history of World War II, in German history, and in the history of the 20th century, which was not the case before, despite what we think today. But as that was happening, this was also the time in which the Soviet Union collapsed and the end of communism was announced. And we were told by some procrastinators that we were entering a new era in which, as one Fukuyama said, the end of history had arrived. History, however, did not quite conform to that observation and kept rolling on. And as it rolled on, in 1992 and in 1994, there were two major genocides. One was in Bosnia, in the former Yugoslavia, and one was in Rwanda. Now, there was a connection, in my mind, between those genocides that occurred in the 1990s and the fact that the Holocaust came to the fore as a major event. And the connection was this, that as the Holocaust was being increasingly studied, the main understanding of what had motivated the genocide and how that continent-wide genocide had worked out and had been facilitated was that certain preconditions were necessary. One was the dehumanization of a certain group, in this case the Jews. That is, to declare that a certain group of people did not fit into the larger context of human solidarity. That this group was somehow outside of that sphere. It could be dehumanized, as the Nazis later spoke about the Slavs as Untermenschen, as subhumans, but it could also be seen as particularly dangerous to our group of solidarity. And that the second precondition, specifically for such cases of genocide, was to create a mechanism that created a distance between the killers and the killed, between the perpetrators and the victims. That was important, it was argued, because it was very difficult for human beings to kill large numbers of other innocent human beings. And that even in the case of the Holocaust, we knew that members of the SS, of the Einsatzgruppen, of those who were perpetrating genocide, had psychological difficulties in long-term killing of innocent people. And there were cases of drunkenness, of some disobedience, and so forth. And so that a mechanism had to be created that would distance the two. And that was done both ideologically by speaking of the victims as distant from the rest of humanity, but also through a bureaucratic process. And that process was that compartmentalizing the killing. So that, to give you a simple example, if there was a neighborhood of Jews in Berlin, in Grunewald, in Berlin, and those Jews were deported, what their neighbors would see would be that those Jews would be led or would walk in their winter coats with their little suitcases to the train station and would depart. And people knew that they went to the east. And that was about it. They would not see them again, and they would hear later on rumors that, well, they were probably killed. But there would not be any other further contact with those people. By the time that group of people would arrive at the killing sites, they would already not look like the good middle-class people that they were when they started off on that journey, because it would have been a very difficult journey. And then, when the process was perfected, within 20 minutes of arriving in that place, they would usually be dead. They would be very quickly undressed. They would be rushed into gas chambers. They would be gassed, and then they would be either buried in mass burial pits or would be transferred to crematoria and burnt. And the people doing that had no contact with the Jews that had come from Grunewald, did not know them, and even in that process, they would see only parts of that. No one was responsible for the entire event. And then, of course, there were the bureaucrats in Berlin who would organize all of that, who would get the train schedules right, who would build, call up the engineers, build the whole mechanism. So this was the understanding of the Holocaust, that the Holocaust mostly was about the creation of extermination camps and the extermination process. I was never entirely satisfied with this explanation because I was interested in the question of the encounter between the perpetrator and the victim. And this kind of historical explanation did away with that encounter. It basically dehumanized the event itself. It took everyone out of it. The victims were only numbers, and the perpetrators were never actually doing the killing. There was hardly anyone who was responsible. And because of what happened in the 1990s, these two genocides in Bosnia and Rwanda, I too began thinking about this entire event differently, because if you know, and some of you may remember, what that was all about, this was a great deal of intimate killing. These were cases in which neighbors killed neighbors. Rwanda was the fastest genocide in history. 800,000 people were killed in 10 weeks, mostly by machetes and fire. Not gunfire, but actual fire, but in many of them in their own churches. And so as I started thinking about how does this understanding of genocide as the Holocaust and the events in Rwanda and Bosnia, how do we put them together? I thought that perhaps the best way to do that would be to examine what happens in one site in the Holocaust. What actually happens when the Germans arrive and begin to kill? What does it look like? And so I had to choose a place to investigate. And the place I chose was a town called Buczacz. Now, Buczacz is a small town in what is now Western Ukraine. It used to be Eastern Poland and Eastern Galicia. As I will say quickly later, I'll give you a sort of very brief survey of its history. In Eastern Europe, most of the Jews lived before the Holocaust, and most of the Jews were murdered in Eastern Europe. And so it made sense to choose a town that was there and that was relatively representative in terms of its size. It was a town of about 15,000 people in 1939, about half of whom were Jews. The rest were Poles and Ukrainians, more Poles than Ukrainians in the town itself and more Ukrainians outside of the town. But I chose that town in particular because I knew some things about it. First of all, it was the home of the only Hebrew language author to have received the Nobel Prize in Literature, Shmuel Yosef Agnon, or Shai Agnon as he is known, received that prize in 1966 and is a great writer. But much of his writing was actually about his own town, and he spent the last 20 years of his life writing the history of his town. That was published posthumously. He couldn't actually finish that book. He kept writing it until his last day. And it's a beautiful book. So I knew something about it because I studied Agnon when I was in high school in Israel, and I liked his literature very much. It was also the town of two other important individuals. One you may have heard of is Simon Wiesenthal, who was known later as the Nazi hunter. And the other, Immanuel Ringelblum, who was the founder of the archive of the Warsaw Ghetto. And thanks to him, we actually know the history of the Warsaw Ghetto. I won't go into all the details of that, but he was born and raised in Buczacz and went there to the high school, to the gymnasium. But it was also my mother's hometown. And I thought that if I'm choosing a town already that I would study, I might as well study a town that my mother came from, because I didn't know anything about that town. Now, my mother was born in 1924, and her parents, and her two brothers left Buczacz in 1935 and went to Palestine. So she was not there during the Holocaust. As was the case with most Jewish families in Eastern Europe at the time, my own family was a large extended family. Much of the social interaction between people was really within families. None of the rest of my family survived. So the only members of my family who survived were those who left in 1935. And although I studied that town, as I said, for a very long time, and I know now very well how the Jews there were murdered, I don't know specifically how members of my own family were murdered. I just know that they died, and I know how they might have been killed, what the options were. And there were limited options. So in order to have a more intimate understanding of the town, I not only discovered that my mother came from there, I also decided to interview her. And I did so in 1995. And when I spoke with her in 1995, she told me for the first time about her childhood. And what struck me as she was talking about it was that she was not talking about a town in which there was fear, in which there was anti-Semitism, in which people were at each other's throats at all. She spoke about a nice childhood. They spoke Yiddish at home. She studied in a Polish school, and her girlfriends were mostly Ukrainian. So she spoke Yiddish, Polish, and Ukrainian. She remembered fondly going to the forest to pick mushrooms with her Ukrainian girlfriends. As she was talking about that, it occurred to me that my initial question may have not been sufficient. That is, I was asking myself about the encounter between the perpetrators and the victims. But there was not only an encounter between perpetrators and victims. There were other people living in that town who were not targeted by the Nazis. Those were Poles and Ukrainians. So what was the nature of that event, writ large, and not only as an encounter between perpetrators and victims, and to what extent, and this was the question that I started asking myself, to what extent did the relations between people on the ground, between these three ethnic and religious groups, inform the manner in which the genocide actually occurred? So it was no longer simply the encounter with the killers. It was also the dynamics, the social dynamics within that town, and how that influenced the actual event of genocide. So I'll give you a little bit of the background, because as was mentioned, Jews, Poles, and Ukrainians, who were not really called Ukrainians earlier on, but I won't get into all the nitty-gritty of that. We can talk about it later if you like. So Poles, Jews, and Ukrainians lived in that town for about 400 years. And in fact, they didn't know any other existence. The only existence they knew was living one next to the other. They lived there in medieval Poland, in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, on the borderlands of that Commonwealth. They later, after 1772, when Poland was partitioned, they lived in the Austrian province of Galicia, which was a part of Poland that was torn out of Poland and annexed to Austria. The Austrian Empire, the Habsburg Empire, was a multi-ethnic, multi-religious empire, and they lived in the poorest, easternmost province of that empire, as you can see. They then lived after World War I in resurrected Poland. In 1918, Poland was resurrected after World War I, and they lived in that part of Poland which was mostly not Polish. Poland in the interwar period was only 60% ethnic Polish and 60% Roman Catholic, and the largest minority in it was Ukrainian. And most of the Ukrainians in Poland were Greek Catholic, and the second largest minority were Jews. So all of Eastern Poland, which is where now Buczacz was, had a majority of Ukrainians and large numbers of Jews, particularly in the cities and towns. Now, as I said, these ethnic groups lived side by side for this period. It does not mean that this was a pluralistic society. It does not mean that it was multicultural in any modern sense. Each group had its own religious identity and a kind of ethnic identity. But at the same time, for most of the time, they were not killing each other. They, in fact, had each of them a place in that society, a niche in that society that explained to themselves who they were and how they interacted with others. And that's important to understand because often when we think about Eastern Europe, we think Eastern Europe is that place where there was always a lot of violence and people were used to that kind of violence. This was not the case for much of the time. Now, what we need to understand is what then was the dynamic that led from a multi-ethnic, multi-religious society where people played certain socio-economic roles. What led from that to a moment of animosity that later on became violent? And I would say that the most important element is the rise of nationalism. Now, clearly, when the violence begins in that region, and it begins in World War I, it has to do a great deal with the entry of external forces, with the fact that there's a world war and major armies come into that area. But we also need to understand the internal dynamic of these towns. And one of that is the rise of nationalism. Now, in Galicia, in that area, and in much of the rest of Eastern Europe, nationalism begins in the second part of the 19th century. And the nationalist discourse creates a competition over space. In Galicia, the Polish narrative the Polish nationalist narrative is that the Poles had come to those lands of the East in order to civilize them. These were lands that were mostly empty, and the people, the indigenous population that was there, was primitive and barbarous. And the Poles came to nationalize them, to civilize them. So the Poles had a kind of civilizing mission. Those of you who would want to read about that can read another Nobel Prize laureate, Henryk Sienkiewicz, whose novel By Fire and Sword, Ogniem I Mieczem, is precisely the 19th century reinvention of how the Poles came to civilize the East and the wild lands of the East in the 17th century. Sienkiewicz, by the way, because he needed to imagine that and didn't quite have, couldn't go back to that time there, decided to investigate the Wild West in order to be inspired to write about the Polish Wild East, and went and spent some time in America to see what it looks like when you civilize wild areas, which is somewhat ironic in our context. The Ukrainians spoke of themselves within their own national narrative as the indigenous population that had been colonized by the Poles, brutalized and serfed and exploited. And so while the Poles said that they came to liberate and to civilize, the Ukrainians said they had been subjected to Polish colonizers. And the Jews were perceived as those who were the Poles' lackeys, those who came together with the Poles to exploit the local population. The Jews themselves perceived themselves not as owners of the land. So they were not part of this competition between Ukrainians and Poles over to whom does the land belong and who belongs to it. They spoke of themselves only as those who came to develop commerce, develop cities, were people of the book, were studying, but they had no assertion of ownership on the land. And as Jews are also in Eastern Europe influenced by this nationalism, which is territorial ethnic nationalism, when they develop it, they mostly become Zionist. And so when they speak about ownership of land, they don't speak of ownership of the land in which they are, but ownership, potential ownership of the land that they would go back to, that is to Palestine, to the land of Israel. Now, all of this is happening in the latter part of the 19th century and the early 20th century, and the discourse, the conversation between the groups becomes increasingly violent. But there's no actual violence on the ground, or very little thereof, certainly not in the small towns. And in many ways, as you can see in this election rally, where a number of the people can be identified, including Agnon, who was then 19, the politics was very much created along these ethnic lines. So there were Polish parties, Ukrainian parties, and Jewish parties, and they went in coalition with each other. And so there was a kind of working relationship that was very much administered by the multi-ethnic Habsburg Empire, by the Austrian Empire, which was not a nationalist empire. It could not be by definition, because it was made up of many nations. However, all of this collapses in World War I. So in 1914, when World War I begins, the war in the East, about which most people in the West don't know much, was extremely destructive. Now, it was destructive not only in the way that all wars are, and that World War I was also in the West, but also in the sense that it incited different national ethnic groups against each other. And this is very much the case in the area of Galicia. So while there were Polish, Jewish, and Ukrainian soldiers serving in the Austro-Hungarian army, as it was called then, the Poles were really about creating a free, independent Poland. They did not care much for the existence of the Austrian Empire. The Ukrainians in that area wanted to create an independent Ukraine. The only people who were, as they were called then, Kaisertreu, or loyal to the Kaiser, were the Jews. And the Jews were loyal to the Kaiser not because they loved empires, but because they were afraid of what would happen if the empire would be replaced by nation states, which is indeed what ends up happening. So in that brutal war, not only is there major destruction and growing violence between the groups, but when the war ends, it does not end in this area. In 1918, the Austro-Hungarian Empire collapses, and that is only the beginning of a war between Poles and Ukrainians over the land of Galicia. It's a very brutal war with many massacres. Most people don't remember that because of what happened in World War II, so there's a tendency to forget World War I. But by the time this struggle ends, and it ends only in 1921, so after 6-7 years of war and civil war and brutalities, the Poles take over the entire region. But the Ukrainian minority that fails in accomplishing its own statehood is seething with anger. And the Poles suppress Ukrainian nationalism with increasing brutality. So what we have is the landmark moment of World War I transforms a discourse of nationalism that begins 30, 40 years before World War I, and has many elements of animosity, but not real violence, into an instance of violence, and violence on a vast scale, much of it directed against entire populations, not against combatants. So by 1929, the Ukrainians in this area who feel that they're being suppressed by the Poles create an underground. And that underground, which is known as the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, the OUN, is affiliated with other fascist organizations. It is authoritarian, anti-democratic, and it calls for the creation of a Pole-free and Jew-free Ukraine. And it has an increasingly anti-Semitic rhetoric throughout the 1930s. The Jews, as I said, by this time are increasingly tending toward Zionism. But the problem for Jews living in this area by the 1930s is that they cannot easily get out of there. By then it is clear to most Jews living there that they're not wanted, not by the Poles, not by the Polish government, which becomes increasingly anti-Semitic also in its formal policies, and not by the local population. But this is the time of the Great Depression. As you know, economic difficulties don't make for welcoming refugees. It's very hard to immigrate. The United States used to be the land of immigration. Now it has very strict laws against immigration. And in Palestine, which was the other target, there is an Arab uprising in 1936. And as a result of that, the British authorities there greatly limit Jewish immigration to Palestine as well. So Many Jews feel that they're stuck in that area, they cannot come out, and they're not wanted where they live. Some of them veer to communism. The only communists in Buczacz itself are about 20 Jews. They're entirely ineffectual politically. There's actually a mole also that the Polish authorities have who reports to them on what's going on within that cell. What is interesting about these young men and women, and there were quite a number of women there, is that those who survive all this persecution in the 1930s become the leaders of Jewish resistance against Nazi occupation after the Germans arrived there in 1941, and most of them, such as these two, are killed during that time of Nazi rule. Now, the last thing that we need to understand before I get into the actual killing by the Germans is that in 1939, this area is taken over by the Soviet Union. I don't know if you are taking here a class on World War II, but you may know that World War II actually breaks out because there is an alliance between Nazi Germany and Stalin's Soviet Union. And that alliance, in its secret protocol, divides Eastern Europe between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. In that division, the eastern part of Poland is given to the Soviet Union. And so in 1939, the Soviets take over this area, and the Soviets do what the Soviets do best. First, they nationalize the economy, and an economy that was pretty not very functional to start with totally collapses. And secondly, they start targeting groups that they see as their social and political enemies. They deport first large numbers of Poles, particularly aristocrats and political leaders, members of the army and so forth. Then they deport Jews whom they see as either as social enemies, as the middle class, or as Zionist activists. And then toward the end of Soviet rule, they start arresting large numbers of Ukrainian nationalists. Ukrainians were quite happy when the Soviets marched in 1939 because they saw this as liberation from the Poles. But by 1941, they don't like the Soviets very much either because they realize that they're not going to get an independent Ukraine from the Soviets. And it is at that point, on the 22nd of June, 1941, that the Nazi Germany, that had an alliance with the Soviet Union, attacks the Soviet Union. And so thousands of Ukrainian political activists who had been incarcerated by the Soviets are now killed by the Soviet secret police, by the NKVD, as the Soviets are retreating in the face of the German attack. The NKVD is given orders either to take the political prisoners with them or to shoot them, and of course they choose to shoot them rather than to drag them along. And so several thousand Ukrainian political activists are executed brutally in the jails, and immediately thereafter, even before the German forces arrive, widespread pogroms occur along this entire area. These are pogroms by Ukrainian national activists and by the local population, and they are motivated by the argument that the killings of Ukrainian patriots had to do with Jewish collaboration with the Soviets. This is what the Germans called Judeo-Bolshevism. The Poles talk about the Żydo-Komuna. That is, the Jews and Bolsheviks are the same thing, and therefore that our boys who were killed by the Soviets were actually killed by our own Jewish neighbors. And so we have a vast wave of violence, first by the Soviet secret police, followed by popular violence in many, many towns. This is even as the Germans are marching into that area. And of course, the SS, the Gestapo, greatly encourage this kind of understanding by the local population. They praise the population for understanding that what they have to do is to cleanse themselves of the Jews. Now, in the town of Buczacz itself, immediately as the Soviets are retreating, a Ukrainian militia is organized, of about 100 men, and that Ukrainian militia engages in killing, arresting, beating up people who either worked with the Soviets while there was Soviet rule there, or settling other accounts with people on the ground. There is a major celebration of the arrival of the Germans. Ukrainian nationalists believe that they will be given now, finally, an independent Ukrainian state. And while Hitler has no intention whatsoever of doing so, the Germans on the ground are very happy to work together with Ukrainians in order to establish their rule on the ground. And so these kind of national events are celebrated. By 1943, just to jump ahead a little bit, the SS also recruits an entire SS division, Galicia, from among Ukrainian activists and other young Ukrainian men in the region, including in Buczacz. Now, the main goal of the German authorities in this area that is now called District Galician, District Galicia, is to kill the Jews. After the first wave of when the Germans conquered this area, small security police units established on the ground. It's interesting to see that in the area of Buczacz, in a town near Buczacz called Chotkov, there is a unit of between 20 and 30 Germans. These 20 to 30 Germans, and these are these fellows here, most of them are German, but even then, a number of them are ethnic Germans from Poland, from Czechoslovakia, from Lithuania. Within the period, mostly between late summer 1942 and early summer 1943, these 20 to 30 men kill about 60,000 Jews in this area, including 10,000 Jews in Buczacz. That is, they kill more Jews in Buczacz than were living there in 1939 because they bring Jews from surrounding small towns and villages, concentrate them there, and then kill them. These men, while they're not engaged in killing, are having a very good time there. They're not threatened by anyone. They have complete, unlimited access to food, to alcohol, to sex, and they have complete and absolute power over life and death. And so they bring their wives, they bring their children, they have mistresses there, and they live a very good life. And indeed, 20 years later, when some of those people were interrogated by the West German police, they spoke about that time as the best time of their lives. Now, of course, 20 to 30 men cannot kill 60,000 people without assistance. And in order to organize that killing, they established, first of all, a battalion of Ukrainian policemen. Most of those policemen are recruited from the original militias, the nationalist militias, which are transformed into police forces under German rule. And they establish local police forces in each of the small towns in the area. And together with those groups, they can sweep into towns, round up numbers of Jews, and kill them. The killing is done in two ways, and that's for all of Galicia and specifically for Buczacz. Half of the Jews in that area are deported by trains to the extermination camp of Buczacz, which was the designated camp for that area, for Galicia. It's on the Polish-Ukrainian border. Even those people who are deported to an extermination camp, the deportations themselves in the small towns are extremely brutal. They're very public. Many hundreds of people are killed during the operations of rounding up and pushing people into trains. So everyone can see what is going on. But as of the end of 1942, the extermination camp of Buczacz is closed. And from then on, the killing is in situ. So if you look at this aerial photograph of Buczacz, you can see that the two killing sites at the Jewish cemetery at the top and at the Fedor Hill at the bottom, on both sides of the town. You can see where the town hall is, right in the center. So if you stand in the center of town, you can see both sides. If there is gunfire or machine gun fire on either side, you can hear it. In the case of Buczacz, well over half of the Jews are killed between February 1943 and June 1943 in those sites. And in fact, they're still there in mass graves, although they're not marked. And so we have to understand that the way things work out in such a small town is that everything happens on the ground. Everyone is engaged in one way or another. Nobody can say that they didn't see or didn't hear. It's happening in full view. Now, once most of the Jews are murdered, and I won't go into all the details, but Galicia itself is declared Judenrein, or clean of Jews, or Judenfrei, free of Jews, in June 1943, but there's still killings going on until the following summer. But once most of the Jews are dead, a civil war erupts between the Ukrainians and the Poles. The Germans are not interested in that war at all. That's not their agenda. Their agenda was to kill the Jews. They don't really care about the Poles and Ukrainians there. But the Ukrainian insurgent army, which is established in 1943, and which is the armed organization of the OUN, of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, sweeps down into Galicia and begins ethnic cleansing of the Poles in Galicia. And the Poles don't take it lying down. They also organize militarily. And so what happens is that there is ethnic cleansing of Poles, but there is also mutual massacres in numerous villages with very high numbers of civilians and others killed. Combatants, but much more civilians are killed. Now, having given you this, I just want to quickly touch on what happens thereafter and then give you some of my own conclusions. So Ukrainians today in such towns, what they most would remember was the brutal suppression of Ukrainian nationalism by the Soviets when they entered in 1944. And indeed, it was brutal suppression. Large numbers, there was an insurgency of Ukrainians against the reoccupation of Western Ukraine as they saw it by the Soviets. And as a result, the Soviets used their own methods and deported large numbers of people to gulags and to Central Asia. What people don't want to remember and don't talk about is the fact that there was massive collaboration, particularly by Ukrainians in many of these towns, certainly in this one. One of the individuals who was later captured and tried and spent many years in a gulag was Volodymyr Kaznovsky, who was a district attorney, who became chief of the police and actually was in charge of much of the Ukrainian police in the area throughout the time of German rule there. The Soviets, when they came, actually investigated what happened in that genocide. They exhumed some bodies. They drew such sketches. They wrote reports. They did it through a Soviet prism. So they spoke really about innocent Soviet victims, and they didn't like to talk very much about local collaborators. But at least they collected some facts initially. But thereafter, they lost all interest in that. So this memorial that was put up in 1945 by the 60 survivors who were in the town out of a population of 8,000 Jews was shortly thereafter removed, and probably by the Soviet authorities. Instead, over that hill, the Fedor Hill, where vast numbers of people, about 5,000 people, are buried, a forest was planted. It's almost impossible to find the mass grave. There's one small memorial there, but it's very hard to find it. As you can see, it's sort of hidden in the forest. There is one big memorial on the hill, but that memorial is to the heroes of Ukrainian, the Ukrainian War of Liberation, and to the martyrs of the OUN and UPA, of the insurgent army. There is also now another memorial to the head, the commander of the Ukrainian Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, Stepan Bandera, which also overlooks the town. Whereas on the Jewish cemetery, which was the second site of mass killing, it is largely neglected. And you can see from this photo the proximity between the hill of the cemetery and the other hill behind with the tree line, which is the second site of mass killing. The town is in between the two. One memorial was put up there some years ago, but it's since been broken. And again, it's usually in the summer. It's impossible to approach because it's covered with thorns. The major edifice, Jewish edifice in the town, was the Große Schild, the Great Synagogue. That synagogue was damaged but not destroyed in the war. But after the war, the Soviets dismantled it and replaced it with the Kinotheater, this elegant building here, which was the Soviet statement of culture. And the last remaining building, which was the prayer house, that Agnon writes a lot about. He remembers sitting there as a boy and looking out to the town, remained there until 2001, when the mayor of the town decided to bulldoze it and replace it with a shopping center. And so what is left now in Buczacz is the remnants of the Polish castle, the medieval castle. And as you know, now there's growing patriotism in Ukraine because of the war with Russia in the Donbass, in eastern Ukraine. And you can see that on top of that castle, what is now fluttering is the wave of the Ukrainian insurgent army, which actually hasn't existed for decades, but is a symbol of Ukrainian nationalism and patriotism. So now, with your permission, if you still have enough energy, I'm going to just touch on a few conclusions. First, I'd like to say that as I started this project, I was thinking about the encounter between perpetrators and victims, and the one thing that I understood was that the genocidal encounter, certainly in about half of the Holocaust, so about half of the victims of the Holocaust were not killed in extermination camps, but occurred as it did in Buczacz, that it was intimate and not detached. I should add that many of the Germans who were there in that town and in other towns, before they killed the Jews, they got to know them. They used them as their babysitters, as their house cleaners, as their tailors, as their dentists, as their doctors, as their drivers. They got to know them by name, and the Jews got to know them. And so when the killing began, even when it was Germans killing Jews, and there were many other neighbors who were killing their Jewish neighbors, that killing was very intimate in the sense that they knew each other. So it was not detached, and it was not anonymous. It was intimate, and it was familiar. The killing was also public and not secret. We had this idea of the Holocaust as being a secret event. Did the Germans know what was happening? This was the question that many historians asked. Well, it's a question what the Germans knew if they were living in Berlin or Hamburg, but people on the ground in Eastern Europe knew exactly. There was nothing secret about it, and nobody tried to make it secret. It was public, and it was intentionally public. Another important point, I would say, is that we have this notion, which I think is somewhat convenient when we think of genocide in general and about the Holocaust specifically, that there are three categories of people. There are perpetrators, there are victims, and there are bystanders. And the bystanders are the majority usually, and although their moral stance, their ethical position may be somewhat problematic, they're not killers. So we'd like to think of ourselves at worst as bystanders. We don't want to be victims. We can't imagine ourselves as perpetrators, most of us, I hope. So we like to think of humanity and including ourselves as bystanders. But in such cases as Buczacz, there were no bystanders. It doesn't exist. When you live in a small town, it's only a matter of engagement, of a degree of engagement. How much are you engaged in that? And you can move from one category to another, and not only in one direction. You can do one thing and then another, and then one thing and then another, but you cannot be unengaged. I always think about it in terms of living in an apartment block, and the people upstairs one day are taken out and shot on the street, and you know them. Their daughter studied with your daughter in your kitchen. They did math homework every evening together. But now they've been shot. And the apartment upstairs is better than yours. It gets better air. They have a piano there. They have better dishes. So do you move in, or do you let the people from the third floor move in? And if you move in, what are the implications of that? Once you have moved in, you have already become part of the process. You're already engaged. You're already profiting from genocide. And genocide, as you may know, is a profitable business for many people. People gain property. People gain status because other people are removed or killed. So this category of bystanders disappears. That leads to my own understanding that when you look at such local genocide, we can say we know what bad is. I mean, there are evil people who are engaged, who have a clear decision, an ideology that certain groups of people have to be eradicated. Okay, so that's understood. But what about the good? And what you find here, I think, is an ambiguity of goodness. Most of the people who survived, in Buczacz and in hundreds of such towns, most of the Jews who survived because someone saved them. You couldn't survive on your own. There was no way that you could do it. Even if you went to the forest, you needed somebody to give you shelter in winter, to give you food. You could not survive on your own. So people helped you, and the people who could help you would be either your neighbors or other Gentiles who were not directly targeted themselves, but were risking their lives for doing that. But that does not mean that, okay, so there were these altruistic people who saved some Jews. Because often Jews had to pay in order to be given shelter. And sometimes when they ran out of whatever they had to give, if it was money or gold or whatever, jewelry, whatever they might have had, then there was not much point keeping them. And if the people keeping them were poor and didn't have enough money to buy some extra bread and some extra milk, what do you do with those people who are now in your cellar or in your attic? You can tell them to leave. You can denounce them, because if you let them leave, somebody is going to say those people were sheltering them, and they may have made money from them, so you call the police, and the police may punish you for it, burn down your house, kill you and your children. Or you can kill them yourself. And all of this was happening at the same time. There were many cases of people who gave shelter and later on killed the people that they were sheltering. And so when we think about goodness, I think, and the ambiguity of goodness, we understand much better the nature of this phenomenon than if we only divide it into evil and good. Much of the experience was that experience. You had to trust someone, and either you were given help or not, and if you were given help, you never knew for how long and what might be the consequences. So I would add to this another, I think, important element is, as I was telling you earlier, that we cannot understand the nature of this kind of local genocide without understanding its deeper historical roots. When the Germans come to these towns, they don't know anything about their history and they don't care. They come and they have a mission and they carry out the mission. But for the people on the ground, the relations that were there and the views that they have of themselves and of each other determine the nature of that event. It makes a difference. So in that sense, how people lived and how they remembered living together had an impact on how they behaved vis-à-vis each other during the genocide itself. And the Germans, of course, once they understand it, they make use of it. And while they're very thin on the ground in Galicia, there are only a few hundred perpetrators, they managed to kill 500,000 people. And they do it because they make use of these ethnic, religious tensions that had been created there for about a century before they arrived. To this I would add, just as an historian, it's important for me to stress, because many historians of the Holocaust were very skeptical about using personal testimonies, saying, well, these are subjective, these were often taken long after the event, people don't remember names and dates, we can't really trust them. So what they did, they used only documents from archives, because those can be trusted. They have nice dates stamped on them. You know that what they say is what happened. But of course, these are mostly documents created by the perpetrators, because victims didn't have time to organize an archive. And so if you actually want to understand what happens in such an event, you have to listen to the people who were there. And those people left testimonies, thousands of testimonies. In the Shoah Foundation in USC, there are 52,000 such testimonies. I found about 70 testimonies about Buczacz in that archive alone. Those people tell you something that you would never find from official German documents. They tell you about the perspective of the people who were hunted down. They actually rehumanize the event. They do precisely the opposite of what I said at the beginning, this view of only writing it from above. That is, dehumanizing the event. They talk about the relations between people. Most of Jewish testimonies speak not about the Germans, but about their neighbors. Because what mattered, as I said, was how your neighbors acted toward you. And much of it is filled with bitterness and resentment and anger, but some of it also with great gratitude for those who saved them. And so you write a completely different history of that event and of any genocide if you actually listen to the victims, however subjective they might be. And to say that a Gestapo official's document is objective, to me, is somewhat questionable. Two last points. One is that the perceptions that we have, we talk about collaboration, we talk about liberation, right? We talk about heroism, and we think we know what we're talking about. But when you apply that to these areas, you realize that one person's collaboration is another person's resistance. One person's liberation is another person's reoccupation. For the Jews living there in 1944, when the Soviets returned in the summer, they're liberated. For the Ukrainians, they're reoccupied. And that is not only how they feel then, that's how they remember the event until today. That's actually still in the historiography. And so, again, if you look at it from down below, you have a very different understanding of the event itself. There is a historiography now that speaks about Eastern Europe, or as they've been called, the Bloodlands, as an area to which the population was subjected to vast violence coming both from the east by Stalin's goons and from the west by Hitler's goons. And the population there was victimized and 14 million people were murdered. Now, in part it's true, but in part it's untrue. Because much of what happened there, as I tried to tell you, happened because of internal dynamics. When Poles and Ukrainians were killing each other, this was not Stalin's idea and this was not Hitler's idea. When Ukrainians were working together with Germans to kill Jews, this was not part of anybody's idea. This had to do with local internal dynamics, and they actually determined the memory and the politics of memory in Eastern Europe until this very day. It's not only an historical moment, it's very much a political one to this very day. There is a notion now of a double genocide, that there was one genocide by the Nazis, which was mostly killing Jews, and there was one genocide by the Soviets, and in that genocide, Jews took a major part. That's the kind of new discourse now in much of Eastern Europe. And so let me close with this, that my final perception, and it wasn't what I started off with, but in the last 2-3 years, I've started thinking increasingly about that when you study an event like this, it's in Eastern Europe, it's a long time ago, it's got nothing to do with us. And then you start thinking that people lived there a normal life, just like my mother said when I interviewed her. They had friends, they went to the forest, they picked mushrooms, they had a normal life, and they trusted in the security and social order that was there. And then suddenly this thin crust disintegrated, and nothing was as it was before. And I began thinking that many of us, live in our own comfortable, secure neighborhoods, hopefully, and we trust that if anything bad happens, we can call 911 and the police will come and deal with it. And just imagine one day you hear someone out on the street, you think maybe someone is being burglared, maybe there's some violence going on, you call 911, the police arrive and they arrest you. And they take you away. And you suddenly realize that this entire world that you believed in, that you trusted, the next day your neighbor can walk into your house with an axe. This is something that I think when you study such events, you begin to think about your own reality differently, and you begin to think maybe we have to be watchful, we have to guard against this. Thank you. So my father, who was not part of that family then, said, well, you know, your grandfather was a Zionist, because my father was a Zionist. And so he said, your grandfather was a Zionist, and he wanted to go to Palestine. And in part it's true. My mother said, yeah, he was, but his father was very authoritarian, and he needed to move away from his father. And there was nothing he could do there, because by then it was so difficult for Jews to find any occupations, because the Polish authorities closed off high schools for Jews, closed off any occupations in the bureaucracy for Jews. You couldn't work in the railway system. So it was very hard to actually. So he went to Palestine because he also wanted the fresh start. And the interesting thing is that. Just as an anecdote, my grandfather was a simple man of few words, a big, strong man, much bigger than me, but he was what they called a soicher. He was a sort of merchant. He dealt and wheeled. But he knew he needed a certificate to go to Palestine. It was very difficult to go to Palestine. You needed a permission. They called it a certificate. And they were looking for young, strong men to build the new Zionist home. Now, he was already 35 and he had 3 children. He didn't quite fit into that category. So he dressed up as a working man. My mother remembered that he had these smelly boots because they used to put this fat on boots. And he went to the nearby city of Stanisławów, and they saw this big, strong man. They thought, he's going to build a country for us. And the irony was that once they arrived, he did become a blue-collar worker, and he worked as such physical labor until he had a heart attack and died a few years later. And so, in a sense, he transformed himself and was transformed by that. I would also say, to me, it was very interesting because these were people who never had, they were simple people. They never had what the Germans call Schadenfreude. They never said, why did our family not leave? They should have left too. They never said that. And they never complained about, they were very poor in Israel and they never really made it. But they never complained about that either. But they lost not only their families, they lost their entire social context. Because as I said, the family was your society. And they never had it after that. So they were very lonely. And that is something that no one quite understands in this history, that the people who came out also had this loss of context that remained with them until the day they died. Jews do form violent groups, but they form it when they go to Palestine. As soon as they go to Palestine, not in 1948, but right at the beginning, they start forming, Shomer groups. In fact, Zionism is all about the transformation, the normalization of Jewish condition. I was a product of that. Now Jews also serve in many armies in Europe, including in World War II in vast numbers, and in World War I in vast numbers. Despite the anti-Semitic rhetoric, Jews are actually serving and dying in sufficient numbers, just like everybody else. But for Jews to form their own groups, their own ethno-national groups in Europe as a minority is not a particularly good idea, because they are isolated, they're insulated, they have nothing to rely on. So once Jews normalize their condition and have their own nation state, they tend to be just as violent as anybody else. That's and there is an ethnic conflict in Israel today, which has some very strange and interesting analogies, particularly with Poland of the 1930s. And I was struck by some of those, such as promising autonomy to Ukrainians. This was what the Polish government had vowed to do, didn't deliver, and the result was the creation of OUN. And Israel at some point promised autonomy to Palestinians and never really delivered. So, that's one story. The other is really a politics of memory. And I think you're right that this is certainly dragged into the 21st century. It's a complicated issue, and I can't get into all of this, but I would say that if you think about one issue, the issue of refugees, immigration, Eastern Europe, all of Eastern Europe, Poland, Lithuania, Lithuania, Ukraine, Hungary, Romania, these were countries in which there were national movements which wanted to create a nation state in which the vast majority of the people would belong to one ethnos. Usually it coincided with a certain religion. Poles were Roman Catholic. This was Ukrainians were Greek Catholic. And if you were Roman Catholic, you were almost sure to be Polish in those areas. But it was very hard to do when they created these states. These states had vast minorities. And many of the countries, such as Poland, were forced to agree on minorities, on tolerance of minorities, which they greatly resented throughout the 1920s and 30s. Now, eventually they did become almost ethnically pure. And they became that thanks to the policies of the Nazis and the Soviets. It was the combination of Nazi genocide and Soviet population policies. Now, Ukrainian or Polish nationalists wouldn't like to admit that, wouldn't like it to be put that way, but that is historically the fact. Now, when you talk about, when the EU was talking about letting in refugees, Hungary, Poland said, no, forget it, no way. We finally have our own people in our own state. We don't want any foreigners. That is a legacy going back 60, 70, 80 years, right? So that's one. The other is politics of memory. How there is now, right now, a major debate going on about the Polin Museum in Warsaw. So the Polin Museum is a museum of Jewish history in Poland. It was the most important event in Eastern Europe's coming to terms with its Jewish past. And I remember the first time I went there when I was leaving Poland, the guy at the passport control asked me, what was I doing there? And I said I was at an event at the museum. He said, we're all very proud of it, he said to me. And I thought, yes, that's great, And now the new government is trying to eject the director, Stola, of this museum and to install a director who would change the line of the museum, who would make it into something else. So there's a struggle over what is our past, who are we? Can we recognize at least the richness of the past? It was a difficult one, sure, but it was rich. Or do we have to erase all of that? And so I think, yes, this is something that is still very much up for grabs. Because obviously, once I started studying this, I did realize that in the 20s and 30s there was a heightening of these, of anti-Semitism, and not only of anti-Semitism, also of Polish-Ukrainian conflict. So how do I understand it? My mother was 11 when she left. And I think, and I've read by now several hundred accounts by people from there, mostly by Jews, but also by Poles and Ukrainians. Quite a number of very interesting accounts, and some people that I interviewed myself. Children interacted quite well, well into the 1930s. Because as children, they went to school together. My mother could have gone to the Tarbut school. There was a Hebrew language school, but you had to pay for that. So my grandfather sent her to the public school, which was Polish. And it was a good school. So as children, they interacted quite well. But by that time, once people grew a bit older, they started moving into their own ethnic groups and often also into their own socioeconomic roles within that society. And so I think that her memories were memories of a young child, and as a child, she had fond memories. She did remember one neighbor they had who was a Polish nationalist, was a supporter was an Endek, a supporter of the Endecja, which was the anti-Semitic extreme right-wing nationalist party of Poland, and they were all afraid of him. But, you know, her most traumatic memory of this man is that when he died, they put his body out and she saw a dead person for the first time. And that's the most, you know. So she was a child. There's another interesting element. So she remembers other towns in which people, Jewish people, would board up their windows at night. By the early 30s, in Kosów, in one town where they have family. And so there is an argument that in Buczacz specifically, relations were better. And it's possible, you know, each town had its own, they were all similar and they were all different. And there is an argument that in Buczacz, for various reasons, relations were generally better than in some other towns. And one important indication of that, it's problematic, but it's also very interesting, is that Buczacz was liberated for the first time in March 1944, but then the Soviets retreated 2 weeks later, a tactical retreat. For the Soviets, it was a tiny little tactical retreat. But for the Jews, it was a catastrophe, because in March 44, 800 Jews came out of hiding. Now, you'd say 800 out of 8,000 is not that much, but in the terms of the period, it's a lot. So how come so many Jews were in hiding? Is that some people argue that this was an indication that relations there were better. They found more people to shelter them than in other towns. Once the Germans came back, they killed almost all of them. So 700 out of the 800 were killed. So it's possible. Other people say the reason was that there was a small Jewish resistance and they started threatening denouncers, because the only way that the Germans could find Jews who were being sheltered by the local population was that other members of the population would tell them where they're hiding. They couldn't usually find them on their own, and they didn't like going to the forest. It was, you know, they could get shot. So they sent the Ukrainian police or waited for someone to denounce a specific shelter. So I don't know, but it's possible. To me, I think, as I said earlier, what was most important for me was to understand, you know, I started as a German historian, and so I somewhat had a little bit of a German historian's view of it, and I also thought of these towns as the towns to which the Germans came. And what she suddenly reminded me, so to speak, is that the towns had a life of their own. Their existence did not begin when the Germans came there. And that relationship, fraught, but also relationship of neighbors, was very important in terms of how people experienced the events of genocide themselves. Generally, in modern times, to me, the most obvious example are a number of other genocides. I don't know if you know a little bit about what happened in Rwanda, but in Rwanda, you know, the country of 1,000 hills, and on each hill there's a village, and in each village there are Hutu and Tutsi, and they kill each other, or rather the Hutu kill the Tutsi, and almost the entire Tutsi population of Rwanda is killed, and then the new Tutsi population that comes are not the original ones, but the children of those who were expelled earlier in 59 to 62. They come in, and now they're living side by side with Hutu, and they know that there was a genocide there, and they even know who did it. And so, in that sense, there's a society that had existed for centuries. We don't actually know how long, but existed for centuries of Hutu and Tutsi, that at some point, through a process that had a great deal to do with colonization, and they are created as two groups that are at each other's throat. So that's the most sort of obvious example. But and to me, it's important to understand that because I've never liked the argument of the uniqueness of the Holocaust. I always thought, as an historian, that it makes no sense to talk about an historical event as unique. Obviously, all historical events are unique in one sense, but in another sense, you can only understand them in comparison to others. Otherwise, they just stand there, or they become metaphysical events, and then they have no history at all. They're only somewhere up there in the stratosphere. But we want to think about it as something we can learn from, we can understand. So from that point of view, to me, as I said earlier, what I started thinking was how fragile our own communities are, and how easy it is, not instantaneously, but how through a process that can take only a few decades, you can create a condition where people would act in ways that were completely unthinkable before. You know, one thing that people say in genocide, and they were saying it in Buczacz at the time, on the one hand they say, it's unimaginable. I cannot believe that this is happening. Nobody would have expected this to have happened. And on the other hand, the same people are saying, we knew it would happen. You know, they're saying both things at the same time. And why is that? When you see it happening, it's of course unimaginable. Although it's happening, it is imaginable. It's actually real. But you also remember everything that was said before, and all the rhetoric that was used before. And I think that in our society today, in the United States, in societies in Europe, there is increasing talk about certain groups, whether within us or on our borders, that are threatening. That there's something about them that we have to keep out. And that kind of discourse about groups, and I know that from Israel very well, when you talk about people in that way over time, that creates a certain dynamic. If you keep it up, eventually you give license to violence. And that violence is the violence that would happen eventually in your own neighborhood. You can't keep it out only on the border. It has a very, its own intriguing way of filtering in and ending up in your own neighborhood. And one day, you call up and they come and take you away.
We need to end on that note. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks.